At our 10th anniversary dinner, my daughter stood up with her glass of sparkling cider, cleared her throat, and said, "Actually, this family almost lost Mom until she did this." The entire room stopped moving. The forks froze in midair. My sister-in-law's smirk disappeared. The champagne glasses stopped clinking. And for the first time in 10 years, my mother-in-law didn't have anything to say. That one sentence changed everything. But to understand the weight of her words, you need to know how I got there, how I went from smiling through dinner with a stomach full of knots to almost disappearing inside my own life. I married into the Cole family 10 years ago. I was 28, fresh from the city, full of love and the kind of hopeful energy that doesn't know it's walking into a storm. James, my husband, is the kindest man I know, but he grew up in a family that doesn't do kind. Not really. They do sharp and polished and well-behaved, but never warm. His mother, Estelle, greeted me on our wedding day with a kiss on the cheek and the words, "Welcome, dear. I hope you're tougher than you look." I laughed nervously, thinking it was just dry humor. I had no idea how serious she was. That first year, I tried. I tried so hard. I showed up to every Sunday dinner with a homemade dish, smiled at every comment, offered to help in the kitchen, complimented Estelle's perfectly manicured flower beds. I wanted to be accepted. I wanted them to love me. But nothing I did was ever enough. One Sunday, I brought a lemon tort, Estelle's favorite, or so I'd been told. I worked on it for hours. When she took a bite, she smiled that thin, tight-lipped smile and said, "Tartness is a bold choice, but you're trying. That's what matters, for now." Talia, my sister-in-law, laughed and said, "She won't last a year in this family. She's already cracking." I smiled along with everyone else. What else could I do? I couldn't cry in front of them. I couldn't show them they were right. But I didn't sleep that night, and I stopped baking after that. James tried to comfort me, but he didn't understand. "It's just how they are," he said. "They tease." But it didn't feel like teasing. It felt like I was being picked apart in slow motion, one tiny comment at a time. I started shrinking without realizing it. I stopped speaking up at dinner. I nodded when I wanted to push back. I dressed more conservatively, wore my hair the way Estelle said looked cleaner, and bit my tongue when Talia made little jabs. I told myself I was keeping the peace. I told myself it was just a rough start. Then one day, my daughter Mira came into the kitchen after a Sunday dinner and asked, "Mom, why do you look so sad after we see Grandma?" I didn't know what to say. I told her I was just tired, but her eyes didn't believe me. Over time, Mira started watching me differently, like she was trying to figure out the rules of this family by watching how I folded myself smaller and smaller to fit in. That's when I realized I wasn't just losing myself. I was teaching her to do the same. I was teaching her that love means staying quiet, that being accepted means never pushing back, that family means enduring cruelty with a smile, and I couldn't let that happen. So I stopped trying to be liked. I started trying to be whole. I'll tell you how, and what it cost, and how close I came to breaking completely. But what you need to know first is this. That night at our 10-year anniversary dinner, when Mira stood up with her little glass and said those words, she didn't just defend me. She reminded me of everything I'd fought to reclaim. She looked across the table, right into the eyes of the people who thought they'd worn me down to nothing, and she said, "Actually, this family almost lost Mom until she did this." And in that moment, she did something I hadn't been able to do in a decade. She made them listen. And now, so will you. I used to think marriage was the finish line. You find your person, say your vows, and the hard part is over. I thought love was enough to make everything else fall into place. When I married James, I believed we were building a life. Just the two of us. I didn't realize that marrying him also meant marrying into a family with its own laws, its own loyalties, and its own quiet punishments for anyone who didn't follow them. We moved to Vermont right after the wedding. James had just taken over his dad's accounting firm. I left behind a job I loved in Chicago and started working remotely so I could be home more with Mira, who was 3 at the time, and Leo, who was just born. I told myself it was temporary, that we'd eventually move back, but months turned into years. And Vermont, with its small-town charm and suffocating closeness, became permanent. At first, I tried to see the beauty in it, the crisp fall mornings, the way snow fell like powdered sugar on the rooftops, the maple syrup festivals, and tiny bookstores. But the one thing I could never romanticize was Sunday dinner. Every week, like clockwork, we drove to Estelle's house, James's childhood home, always the same roast chicken, the same perfect napkins, the same stories told in the same order. If I brought dessert, it was judged. If I wore something too bold, it was noticed. If I said too much, I was interrupting. If I said too little, I was cold. From the outside, it looked like a picture-perfect family gathering, but I was never relaxed. I was performing. James didn't see it, or maybe he didn't want to. To him, this was normal. Estelle had always been like that, blunt, efficient, emotionally sterile. His father, Warren, had passed a few years before we got married, and since then, Estelle ran the family like a one-woman committee. Talia, his younger sister, followed right behind her. Same sharp tongue, same fixation on appearances. Talia once told me, "You're not like the rest of us, but I guess every family needs a wild card." It sounded like a joke, but it didn't feel like one. I remember the first time I tried to share something real at the table. It was after I'd started designing again. Freelance architectural sketches for a boutique firm in Boston. I was excited. For the first time in months, I felt useful beyond diapers and dishes. I mentioned the project during dinner, and Estelle barely looked up from her plate. "Well, as long as it doesn't take away from your duties at home," she said. Talia chimed in with a laugh. "Don't let her start believing she's important. That's how moms go rogue." I laughed along. That was my role. Laugh along. But inside, something wilted. The worst part wasn't what they said. It was what they didn't say. No one asked follow-up questions. No one said congratulations. No one cared that I was trying to keep a piece of myself alive. My wins weren't welcome there, only my obedience. James would rub my back in the car afterward and say, "They just don't know you yet. Give it time." But I did. I gave it years. And in the process, I started to fade. I stopped bringing up my work. I dressed in muted colors. I kept Mira and Leo quiet at the table because I knew if they spilled juice or used the wrong fork, there would be a lecture. I wanted them to be liked. I wanted us all to be safe from Estelle's judgment. I kept telling myself, this is what mothers do. We sacrifice. But deep down, I knew I wasn't just sacrificing my time or my pride. I was sacrificing who I was. I was teaching Mira that shrinking herself was the price of being loved. And Mira, God Mira, even at 8 years old, she was already watching me closely. Too closely. She saw how I stiffened when Estelle criticized the kids. She noticed how I avoided eye contact with Talia. One day she asked me, "Do you like going to Grandma's house? Or do you just go because Dad says we have to?" Didn't answer. I changed the subject. But that question never left me. That house. That table. That version of me. Silent, agreeable, ghost-like. It wasn't just uncomfortable. It was dangerous. Not just for me, but for the little girl who was learning what love looked like by watching me endure it. And that was the beginning of the end of my silence. It didn't happen all at once. That's the thing people don't understand about emotional damage. It's not one big, loud moment. It's slow, subtle. It's 1,000 little paper cuts. Day after day, until one day you look down and realize you're bleeding everywhere. I used to think I was imagining it, that maybe I was too sensitive, that maybe it really was all harmless teasing, and I just didn't get their sense of humor. That was the story James told me anyway, every time I came home from dinner, feeling like I'd been chewed up and spit out. But I wasn't imagining it. It got worse once Mira started getting older, more opinionated, more curious. She asked questions. She didn't always sit perfectly still, and Estelle didn't like that. I could see it in the way her eyes narrowed when Mira used the wrong fork or asked for ketchup with chicken. Every tiny deviation from refined was a problem, and every time Estelle commented, it landed like a warning shot aimed at me. She needs more structure, Nina. Kids crave discipline. I'd never have let James talk to an adult like that at her age. You let them run too wild, it's starting to show. Each time, it was delivered with a smile, not a kind one. The kind that cuts you clean and expects a thank you. Talia was no better. Her comments weren't disguised. She said what Estelle only hinted at. "She's still wearing those shoes?" she once said with a laugh. Bold move, considering how fragile her ankles looked last Christmas. Another time, I'd ask if you're okay, Nina, but you look like you'd just cry if I did. It became a routine. I'd get through dinner, smiling, holding Mira's hand under the table, distracting Leo with crackers. I'd count the minutes until we left. Then I'd cry in the car silently with the kids asleep in the back and James staring ahead, saying nothing. Eventually, even James stopped defending me. When I brought it up, he'd shrug. "They're just used to their way of doing things," he said. "You take everything so personally." But it wasn't just personal. It was targeted. I was being worn down, reshaped, and the worst part was, I let it happen. Because I didn't want to be the reason James chose between his mother and his wife. Because I wanted Mira and Leo to know their grandparents, even if I had to endure things they didn't understand yet. Then one night, I cracked. It was a random Sunday. Nothing especially cruel was said, just the usual underhanded remarks, the dismissive tone. I was telling a story about Mira's school project, and Talia interrupted halfway through to talk about her new mindful stretching workshop. Everyone shifted their attention instantly. No one even noticed I'd stopped talking. I excused myself to the bathroom, walked out the front door instead, got in our car, and sat there alone for nearly 40 minutes. My hands were shaking. I remember gripping the steering wheel just to feel like I existed. When I came back in, no one asked where I'd gone. That night, while brushing Mira's hair before bed, she asked, "Why do you always look smaller after Grandma's house?" Smaller. That word hit me like a freight train. I told her I was fine, that it was just grown-up stuff, but I went to bed that night staring at the ceiling, wondering when I had become someone my daughter pitied. I started sleeping less. I ate because I had to, not because I felt hungry. I stopped painting. I pulled away from friends. There were days I didn't recognize my own voice. At my lowest point, I remember looking in the mirror and whispering, "Is this all there is now?" Not because I wanted to leave, but because I didn't know how to stay in a life that felt so hollow. And all the while, I kept showing up, every Sunday, every comment, every look, every fake laugh. Until one day, I found a picture Mira had drawn in school. It was of our family, stick figures, smiles, a sunny sky. But I wasn't standing with them. I was floating in the corner, drawn in light gray pencil like a ghost. That was the moment I realized I couldn't do it anymore. I wasn't just losing myself. I was teaching my daughter how to disappear, too. And that was the first time I let the thought enter my mind. Something has to change, even if it costs me everything. Would you like me to continue with Section 4, the turning point, decision or action taken? Next? 40-something had to change. That much was clear. But change doesn't start with a fight. It starts with a question you stop ignoring. For me, that question was, who am I becoming in this house? Because the woman I saw in the mirror every morning, tired, dull-eyed, careful, wasn't someone I recognized. She was a version of me molded by fear, a version made for survival, not joy. After I found Mira's drawing, I stared at it for a long time, a small sketch in the corner of the page, me, alone, floating. Everyone else, James, the kids, even Estelle and Talia, drawn in color, solid, smiling, together. I asked Mira about it that night while she was brushing her teeth. "Hey," I said gently, "why am I way up in the corner in this picture?" She shrugged. "That's where you always are when we're at Grandma's house." And she went back to brushing. She didn't mean it to hurt. She said it like it was a fact, like the sky is blue and Mom doesn't belong at the table. That night, after everyone was asleep, I stayed up. I opened my journal and wrote the words I hadn't said out loud. I'm disappearing. Slowly, quietly. And no one sees it but my daughter. I realized that if I didn't change something soon, Mira would learn that love means shrinking, that silence is safer than truth, that being accepted means being erased. I couldn't let that be her inheritance. The next morning, I Googled therapists near me. I'd never done therapy before, but I needed someone to talk to who didn't already have a stake in pretending everything was fine. I found someone who specialized in family trauma and sent an email. 2 days later, I was sitting on a couch in her office, trying not to cry as I described how I felt more invisible in a house full of people than I ever had when I was alone. I kept going back. Week after week. I talked about the things I hadn't even admitted to myself, How ashamed I felt for not standing up sooner. How I worried that James would never really choose me. How small I had made myself out of loyalty to a family that had never offered me any in return. My therapist asked me something that still echoes in my head. She said, "If your daughter were in your exact position, what would you want her to do?" Without thinking, I said, "I'd want her to leave the table." That became my compass. Every decision from then on, I ran through that filter. What would I want Mira to do if this were her life? I stopped going to every Sunday dinner. I told James I needed space, not from him, but from them. He didn't take it well. At first, he said I was overreacting, that I was making things worse, that his mom didn't mean any harm. I looked at him and said, "If you don't believe me, then you've never really seen me." He was quiet for a long time, and then, to my surprise, he asked if he could come with me to therapy. I didn't expect that. I honestly didn't know if he had the courage to face it, but he did. At our session, I read from my journal. Things I'd never said out loud before. Things that made him cry. Things that made him ashamed. "I didn't know it was this bad," he said. "No," I said. "You didn't want to." It wasn't an accusation. It was the truth. And to his credit, he didn't run from it. Over time, he started speaking up more. At dinner, if Estelle made a comment, he'd push back. Just enough to send a message. If Talia made one of her digs, he'd change the subject with purpose. The dynamic began to shift, just slightly. But the real change wasn't in James or Estelle or Talia. It was in me. I started hiking every Saturday morning with a group of local women I met at the library. At first, I barely spoke, but being around people who weren't judging me gave me permission to just be. And somewhere between the trees and the silence, I remembered what it felt like to breathe without holding tension in my chest. I said yes to freelance work again. I started painting with Mira on Sunday mornings instead of putting on makeup for Estelle's roast chicken. And slowly, Mira started drawing me differently. Not in the corner, not in gray, but right there, in the middle, next to her. Izamas, it was our 10th anniversary. James wanted to host something special, just family, he said. A nice dinner, some champagne, a few toasts, nothing over the top. When he told me, I hesitated. Family. That word didn't mean what it used to, but I agreed because by then I wasn't afraid of the table anymore. I didn't dress for approval that night. I dressed for myself. Navy blue wrap dress, hair pulled back, simple earrings Mira picked out. I looked in the mirror and, for the first time in years, saw a woman I could respect. We arrived at Estelle's house and everything looked exactly the same, like it always did. Perfect silverware, linen napkins, candles burning in identical glass holders. But I wasn't the same, and that made everything feel different. Estelle gave me her usual smile, the one that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Well," she said, "you made it. 10 years. I'll admit, I wasn't sure in the beginning." Talia chuckled. "She really wasn't. Remember when you brought that lemon thing? God, we were all like, this girl won't last a year." I looked at her. I didn't smile. I didn't flinch. I just said, "I remember." Dinner went on. Mira and Leo sat on either side of me, James across. Conversations circled around vacation plans and home renovations and Talia's new Pilates certification. I let most of it pass through me. I didn't need to fight anymore. Then came the toasts. Estelle stood first. To James and Nina, 10 years. Marriage isn't easy, especially in this family, but you're still standing. Cheers to survival. Everyone laughed politely, glasses clinked, then Talia raised hers. To Nina, you've proven us all wrong. Barely, but hey, you did it. The laughter came again, louder this time. And that's when Mira stood up. No one noticed at first. She had to clear her throat to get their attention. "Actually," she said, holding her tiny glass of sparkling cider, "this family almost lost Mom. You just didn't know it." Silence. She looked around the table, her voice steady, her face serious. 10 years old and standing taller than all of them. You didn't see her crying in the car, or skipping meals, or sleeping during the day because everything felt too heavy. You didn't see how hard she tried, how kind she was when you weren't, how she smiled even when you made fun of her. I did. I saw everything. Estelle opened her mouth, but no sound came. Mira continued. But then Mom started hiking. She painted again. She said no sometimes, and now she's not quiet anymore. And that's the best part. She looked at me, eyes shining. So I just want to say thanks, Mom, for coming back. No one spoke. Not a breath. Even Leo, who's never still, sat frozen in his chair. The silence wasn't awkward. It was thunderous. It was truth, dropped like a stone in the center of a polished table. Talia stared at her glass. Estelle blinked hard, then looked away. James took my hand, and I sat there, not shrinking, not pretending, just being. For the first time in 10 years, I didn't feel like a guest in my own life. After dinner, Estelle didn't say much, just a quiet good night and a longer than usual look. Talia didn't say goodbye at all, but Mira grabbed my hand as we walked to the car and said, I was scared, but I wanted them to know. I looked down at her and said, You made me brave, too. When we got home, I found a letter on our doorstep, from Estelle. It wasn't long, just 4 sentences. Nina, I've watched you change. I thought you were fragile, but maybe I was wrong. Thank you for taking care of my grandchildren. And thank you for showing me what strength really looks like. It wasn't warm, but it was honest. And that was more than I'd ever gotten from her. That night, James held me longer than usual. No words, just his arms around me and the quiet sense that something had finally broken open between us. And maybe, just maybe, we could start over. But it was Mira's voice, echoing in my head as I drifted to sleep, that stayed with me. Actually, this family almost lost Mom, until she did this. And she was right, because I didn't wait for their permission to come back. I just did it. After that night, nothing went back to the way it was, and thank God. The morning after the anniversary dinner, I sat with a cup of coffee in our kitchen, holding Estelle's letter. I reread it 3 times, 4 sentences, no apologies, no warmth. But for her, it was a breakthrough. And strangely, it didn't matter that it wasn't perfect. What mattered was that it was honest. For once, it felt like she saw me. Talia didn't reach out. No text, no message. But I didn't expect her to, and more importantly, I didn't need her to. For years, I had made peace with scraps of kindness, begging quietly for approval from people who enjoyed holding it just out of reach. I wasn't doing that anymore. James changed too, not overnight. He didn't suddenly become this grand defender. But I noticed the little things. When Estelle made a subtle dig during our next visit, he didn't stay quiet. He redirected the conversation. He didn't let it slide. When I told him something about my work, he asked questions, listened, encouraged. We began eating dinner as a family without screens again. We laughed more. Mira talked about her day with a kind of lightness I hadn't heard in a while. Leo drew pictures of all of us, and I was right there, centered, smiling, surrounded. One Sunday morning, instead of going to Estelle's, I made pancakes from scratch. Mira helped me stir the batter. Leo insisted on pouring syrup for everyone, though most of it ended up on the floor. James played soft music while he washed the dishes. It was nothing fancy, but it felt like peace. That's the word I keep coming back to. Not revenge, not triumph, just peace. After 10 years of trying to belong to someone else's version of family, I finally created my own, and it was enough. A few weeks later, Mira brought home a school project titled, Who is Your Hero? I braced myself, thinking it would be her dad or her teacher. She stood in front of the class and said, My hero is my mom. Because she didn't give up, even when people didn't see how great she is. She taught me you can be strong without yelling and kind without being weak. I cried in the parking lot after school, the kind of crying that clears you out, that heals something buried deep. Because that's what this was always about, not just saving myself, but giving my daughter a different story to grow up inside of. One where women speak, one where love isn't measured by how much you can endure, one where silence isn't a survival strategy. I wish I could tell you Estelle transformed, that she softened completely. She didn't. But things shifted. Her comments became less pointed, less frequent. Sometimes we even found common ground. Once she asked me about a design project and actually listened to my answer. That small moment meant more than any fake pleasantries ever could. Talia remained distant. We became polite strangers again, orbiting the same family from different worlds. But I stopped reaching for her. Stop trying to win her over. I realized that not everyone deserves access to the deepest parts of you. And James began doing the work. He still slips sometimes, but now he sees it. Now he stands beside me instead of in the doorway between me and his family. That might be the biggest shift of all. There are still hard days. That dinner table still exists. But I'm not afraid of it anymore because I no longer sit there asking to be loved. I sit there knowing who I am. I hike on Saturdays. I paint again. I've started mentoring other women going through hard transitions, women who are waking up to their own shrinking, just like I did. We talk, we laugh, we cry in safe spaces, and we remind each other that disappearing is not a requirement for belonging. I look at Mira now, and I know she sees a mother who didn't just survive, but chose to come back piece by piece, not for anyone else's approval, but for her own wholeness. And when I think back to that dinner, to the moment Mira stood up and said, "Actually, this family almost lost Mom," until she did this, I don't think about silence or pain or judgment. I think about legacy. I think about how a little girl found her voice just in time to remind her mother to use hers again, and how sometimes the most radical thing you can do is come home to yourself. So if this story made you feel something, if you've ever been in a room where your voice felt small or you fought quietly just to stay whole, I hope you know you're not alone. And I hope you remember this. Your peace is worth protecting. Your voice is worth hearing. And you don't need anyone's permission to come back to yourself. If this story resonated with you, please take a moment to like the video. It helps more people find it. Share it with someone who needs to hear that they're not the only one. And subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. Real, raw, and honest. And if you've got a story of your own, I'd love to hear it. Drop it in the comments. You never know who it might help. Thanks for being here. Thanks for listening. And above all, stay true to you.